Namaste. There have been situations out there in the field in which people went to capture an animal, and as soon as that animal was captured, it died. Or in certain situations, there was an animal that was captured, it was translocated to another area, and after being translocated, after being released into another national park, in a week or say 10 days, the animal died. Now, these sorts of situations in which you have followed all the rules of the book, you have followed all the procedures, you captured an animal successfully, I would say, and the animal dies after a short while, they have been quite enigmatic for a number of us conservationists. Later on, it was discovered that it goes by a phenomenon that is called capture myopathy. Now, capture myopathy is a non-infectious metabolic disease. So, non-infectious means that if an animal has it, it will not be able to transmit it to any other animal. It is not caused by any pathogen. It is a metabolic disease. Metabolic disease meaning that it is an error of metabolism. Now, metabolism is the process through which we take energy using food, we use it for a number of our purposes, we use it for building of our muscles, we use it for carrying out all of our activities. So, it is a combination of catabolism and anabolism. So, catabolism consists of all those processes in which there is some breakdown of the bodily tissues to get energy, and anabolism is a sum of all those processes in which energy is used to build up the body tissues. So, we have catabolism in which you have a tissue that is processed to give you energy. So, an example could be muscle wasting. So, you are not having enough food, the body is losing its resources at a very fast pace. So, basically the body will break down muscle tissues to get energy. So, this is catabolism. Next is anabolism, in which you use energy when it is there and some raw materials, and these are processed to build up something, especially a tissue. So, an example could be, just as before, muscle building. Now, at all times there are some catabolic activities and some anabolic activities that are going on together in the body. So, essentially in some areas there is some wasting of tissues that is happening, and in some other areas there is a build of tissues that is happening, and a combination of both of these, catabolism and anabolism, goes by the name of metabolism. Now, when we say that this is a metabolic disease of animals, it means that there is some problem with catabolic functioning or there is some problem with the anabolic functioning. So, it is a non-infectious metabolic disease of animals with significant morbidity and mortality. What do we mean by these? Significant morbidity means that whenever such a thing happens, it will happen to quite a number of animals. So, essentially suppose you captured say 10 animals and you would find that this disease is happening in all 10 of them or say 9 of them, even though this is a non-infectious disease. So, it has significant morbidity and also significant mortality. So, when you have this disease that is occurring in 10 animals, roughly all 10 of them are going to die. There is roughly 100% mortality when we have capture myopathy, and this disease is associated with pursuit, capture, restraint and transportation of animals. So, it is associated with chasing of animals, which is pursuit, you have captured it, you have restrained it and you are transporting it, and this disease occurs during these stages. What are the clinical signs of this disease? So, whenever you observe such mortality that is happening, in a number of cases we would observe muscle stiffness just before that. So, the muscles of the body become extremely stiff, the animal suffers with quite a lot of muscular pain. It suffers from ataxia. Now, ataxia means there is a loss of full control of bodily movements. So, the animal will not be able to move properly. There would be paresis. Paresis is muscular weakness with partial paralysis. So, as you can observe, there are a number of changes that are going on in the muscles. The muscles have become stiff, they are having pain, the animal has lost control of the muscles, and also there is some amount of weakness and paralysis. Then we would see torticollis, which is turning of head to one side after due to spasms. So, in the case of muscles also we are getting spasm, and because of these spasms the head is being turned to one side. Then prostration. Prostration is the process in which an animal lies stretched on the ground. So, essentially the abdomen of the animal would be touching the ground and the legs would be spread in the front and the back. So, that is prostration. So, again this could also be a symptom of a muscular damage. So, the animal is lying stretched on the ground. Then in the case of paresis, there was a partial paralysis. This could be followed by a complete paralysis of the body, and the animal will typically become obtunded. Now, obtunded means that the animal will lose its sensitivity. So, for instance, if you go towards a wild animal, the animal runs away, but when an animal has gotten this disease of capture myopathy, then it becomes an animal with a dull sense of its surroundings. So, even if you poke this animal is not going to move, it is not going to get up, it will become anorexic. So, in the case of capture myopathy, that goes on for some duration. So, essentially in the case of the example in which we captured animals from one national park to another national park and it died after 10 days. So, during those 10 days we would observe that the animal has lost its appetite, it is not eating properly. Then it also becomes unresponsive to the surroundings and also to a number of stimuli, and then death can occur from within minutes or hours of capture to days or weeks after the inciting event. So, in the terms of pathology, we can say that this could be an acute phenomena in which you captured the animal and it died within minutes or within hours of capture. So, it could be an acute phenomena, or it could even be a bit chronic in which the animal takes a few days or a few weeks to die. So, to understand capture myopathy in more detail, let us look at the other terms that have been used for capture myopathy through the ages. So, essentially all of these terms will give you a basic idea of what is happening in capture myopathy. So, it is muscular dystrophy. So, it involves muscles, and the muscles become dystrophic, which means that there is an abnormal growth or a breakdown of the muscles. Then it is also called the white muscle disease. Now, in the case of our muscles, they have a protein that goes by the name of myoglobin. Now, myoglobin, myo means muscle and globin is a protein which is usually in the form of a very condensed molecule. So, it is not a linear chain of protein, but it is somewhat a rounded protein which goes by the name of globins. Now, this term myoglobin is very similar to another term that we have read before, which is called hemoglobin. So, hemo means blood. So, this is a globin protein that is found in blood, and this protein is extremely crucial for the transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. So, this is the protein that combines with oxygen that we have inhaled in our lungs, and then with this hemoglobin molecule which is there in the RBCs, the oxygen gets transported to different tissues. Now, myoglobin is another similar molecule which is there in the muscles, and this also plays a very important role in the oxygenation of muscles. So, essentially there is a repertoire of oxygen which is present in the muscles. So, whenever the muscles have to exert themselves, they have a source of oxygen that they can tap very easily and very quickly. And as in the case of hemoglobin, so hemoglobin is a red colored molecule, and similarly myoglobin is also a red colored molecule. So, if you look at most of the muscles of the body, they would appear red in color. Now, in the case of this disease, it is called a white muscle disease. White muscle disease because the myoglobins are lost from the muscles and the muscle appears whitish in color. Next is called overstraining disease. So, overstraining disease, because whenever the animal has overstrained itself, so for instance the animal was being chased by one of our scientists, or maybe it was even chased by one of the predators. So, it has strained a lot. So, after a lot of strain it will get this disease. So, it was also called overstraining disease, and also capture disease, because it is normally seen when an animal is captured. It is also called cramp. Now, cramp is severe pain in the muscles. So, most of our athletes suffer from cramps after a very strenuous exercise. So, at times this disease has also been referred to as cramps in the animals. Then it is also called as leg paralysis, because again the muscles lose their function, the animal is not able to move its legs. So, it was also called leg paralysis. It is also called spastic paresis. Now, paresis is a muscular weakness with partial paralysis, and it is combined with spasm. So, it is spastic paresis. Then it is also called as stress myopathy. So, this disease occurs in situations of stress, and it is a disease of the muscles. Myo is muscle, pathy is a disease. So, it is a disease of the muscle that is caused during, or that is brought about by stress. It is also called transport myopathy, again because it occurs when the animal is being transported. At times it was also called as incipient myopathy. Now, incipient means beginning to happen or develop. So, this is a myopathy, it is a disease of the muscles that is beginning to happen or develop when you have captured this animal, or when you are handling this animal, or when you are transporting this animal. Then it is also called as degenerative polymyopathy. So, again myopathy is a disease of the muscles. Polymyopathy is that it combines a number of muscles, and it also combines a number of diseases altogether, and then it is a degenerative disorder because there are some muscles that are breaking down or degenerating. It is also called as muscle necrosis. Now, necrosis is another process in which the muscle loses its functioning and it becomes a dead muscle. So, it is also called as muscle necrosis because the muscles are dying out. Then it is also called as idiopathic muscle necrosis. Muscle necrosis is what we have seen before. Idiopathic means that the cause is unknown. So, basically when we look at all these terms that have been used for capture myopathy, one thing is very clear: it is a muscular disease, it is caused by stress, and it leads to paralysis or necrosis of the muscles. Now, when does capture myopathy happen? So, the predisposing factors have been written in this manner that they become a mnemonic. So, you can remember this by the term seconds. So, seconds, S means species, it mostly affects ungulates. So, for instance, if you are capturing and translocating a tiger, there is a very little chance that you will get a capture myopathy in the tiger. But if you are capturing and translocating, say a gaur is an Indian bison, or say a cheetal, which is a deer, or a sambar, then it is very likely that these animals may get capture myopathy. Then it also depends on the environment. So, as we saw before, it is acutely related with stress, and environment also results in stress. So, essentially when we have high temperatures, very high or very low temperatures, rainfall, very drastic levels of humidity, a steep terrain and so on, then these factors also result in stress to the animal. So, environmental factors are also a predisposing factor. Then it is also capture related. So, when you were capturing the animal, what was the speed at which the animal was being chased? Was it put into a prolonged restraint? So, if there is a high speed, if you have put this animal for a very long time in a restrained position, if there is an excessive handling of the animal which also gives it quite a lot of stress, or if there is an unnatural positioning of the animal for a long period of time, then these also become predisposing factors, and the animal will have a higher chance of getting a capture myopathy. Other diseases, so as we saw in a previous module on diseases, so if there is any other disease that is already present in the animal, then it becomes a predisposing factor for any new disease, also in the case of capture myopathy. Then nutrition, there is vitamin E and selenium deficiency in animals. So, vitamin E and selenium act as antioxidants, and as we saw before, it is concerned with the loss of myoglobins. Now, in the case of myoglobins, when the animal has lost myoglobins, then it will not be able to oxygenate itself. So, there is some error of oxygenation also involved. So, if there are antioxidants in the body in huge doses, then there is a lesser chance that the animal will get capture myopathy. Drugs, so if we are using drugs like opioids and drugs that increase the excitability. Now, in the case of excitability, the animal even though it is having a paralysis in the body, it is able to sense everything. Its brain is working and its brain is working very fast. It is hyper excited. So, in those situations also the animal will feel more amount of stress. So, those drugs will also increase the chances of the animal getting a capture myopathy. Then signalment. Signalment stands for the age, sex and condition of the animal. So, age, very young and very old. So, similar to in the case of any other disease, if we have adults, then they have a much better immune response as compared to very young or very old animals. Similarly, in the case of capture myopathy also, very young and very old animals are most susceptible. Sex, so mostly males are affected because the female hormone estrogen acts as a protective factor in this case, and also condition of the animal. So, if there is a pregnancy, if you have a female that has a pregnancy, then that female will also be at a huge risk. So, how does this disease progress? So, we can say that this disease is comprised of three components. Now, to remember what is happening, we can remember the famous dialogue of Sholay movie, जो डर गया समझो मर गया. So, if there is an animal that is getting a sense of fear, it might result in the death of the animal. So, this is what happens in the case of capture myopathy as well. The first stage is perception of fear. So, if the animal is extremely calm, if it does not perceive any amount of fear, then the animal is much more safe. But once this animal gets a perception of fear, so what happens when we sense fear? Then we get a response that goes by the name of sympathetic nervous system response. Sympathetic nervous response and the role of adrenal glands. Now, what happens when we suffer a situation in which we have a huge amount of fear? Suppose you are walking in a forest and you see a tiger that comes in front of you. What would be the response? Well, the first thing is that our body prepares for a response that is known as fight or flight. So, it is fight or flight. So, essentially we are either going to fight with that tiger or we are going to run away. Now, in both of these situations, we require a number of things that should happen in our body at the same time. So, for instance, our breathing speed should go up, so that we get more amount of oxygen. So, more amount of oxygen gets to our muscles, and so we are able to run fast or we are able to fight the stress. Similarly, our heart rate should go up, because even when we are getting a larger amount of oxygen, this larger amount of oxygen needs to be pumped to all the muscles. Then we would want to have more amount of glucose in the blood. So, there would be a few hormonal responses in which the level of glucose in the blood would go up, because when we are running, then our muscles would be requiring more amount of glucose as a source of energy. Now, all of these processes and a number of other processes, our level of excitement goes up, our pupils will dilate so that we can sense our surroundings in a better way. So, all of these things happen by the action of sympathetic nervous system and also the adrenal glands. So, essentially the adrenaline is a hormone that is secreted by the adrenal glands, which will bring about all of these changes in the body. So, this is what normally happens when we sense fear, and this is also what happens in the case of animals. So, once the animal has perceived fear, then the sympathetic nervous system and the adrenal glands will kick into action, release quite a lot of amount of adrenaline into the body, bringing about all of these changes. And third is muscular activity. So, the animal starts running, or even when this animal is kept captured in one place, then too the action of the adrenal glands would mean that all of these muscles are just flicking at their position. So, there is a lot amount of muscular activity that goes on. So, when we have these three components, then we would get capture myopathy. So, what happens during capture myopathy? So, there is an altered blood flow to the tissues, the amount of blood flow increases, and because the muscles of the body are extremely hyperactive, so there would be an exhaustion of the normal aerobic energy, particularly in the skeletal muscles. Now, what it means is that in most of the situations we have the muscles, and then you give them oxygen, you give them glucose, and then they would perform some amount of work. Now, this is known as aerobic respiration, because in this case we are getting sufficient amount of oxygen into the muscles. But then what happens when the activity of the muscles is greater than the normal activity, because of which it requires much more amount of oxygen. So, our requirement of the muscle is greater than what the circulatory system can provide to the muscles. So, in those cases we would have muscles that would use another pathway without oxygen, and then they would use glucose to perform work, but then it would also result in certain metabolic byproducts like lactic acid. So, a common example is that when you are walking, so you can walk for a very long distance and your muscles will not feel any amount of pain, because your muscles are getting oxygen, they are using glucose, they are doing the work, and then all the byproducts, especially carbon dioxide, are getting flushed out from the system. But then if you go for a sprint, if you go for a very fast running, so in that case the muscles require much more amount of oxygen, and that much amount of oxygen is not being provided to them by the circulatory system. So, in that case the muscles will shift into an anaerobic respiration, that is respiration without air, without oxygen, and in that case glucose is converted into energy, but it also releases lactic acid as a byproduct. Now, if that lactic acid accumulates in the muscles, then it also leads to a sensation of pain in the muscles. Now, in the case of capture myopathy, we have exhaustion of normal aerobic energy, particularly in the skeletal muscles. So, skeletal muscles are the voluntary muscles. So, they are the first one that are affected, and so the body has shifted from an aerobic respiration into an anaerobic respiration. Then this would lead to exhaustion of ATP in the muscle cells, leading to decreased delivery of oxygen and nutrients, increased production of lactic acid, and inadequate removal of cellular waste products. So, essentially in the case of aerobic respiration, it releases 38 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose, but in the case of anaerobic respiration we have only 8 molecules of ATP. So, essentially this process is like 20% as efficient as in the case of aerobic respiration, which is why we do not normally use it as our default mechanism. But because in this case the skeletal muscles are extremely active, so they have exhausted all the ATP or the energy currency that is there in the cells, and after this there would be a decreased delivery of oxygen, and the cells will shift into anaerobic respiration, which generates lactic acid and waste products. And because the level of blood circulation is not that fast, these cellular waste products will not be removed at a very fast pace. So, these metabolic byproducts like lactic acid, they go on accumulating in the cells, which then damage the muscle cells, and they undergo necrosis to a varying degree. So, the muscle cells are damaged because of lactic acid, and then they start dying. Now, when they start dying, then myoglobin and creatine kinase are released from these cells and cause tubular necrosis in the kidneys and acute renal failure. So, what is happening is that when these muscle cells die, the myoglobin that was there in the muscle cells, it gets released into the blood, myoglobin and creatine kinase, which is an enzyme. So, both of these get released into the blood, and then they are taken to the kidneys for removal. Now, kidneys can remove a small dose of myoglobin, but then when it becomes too large, then it also starts causing damage to the kidneys. So, it results in tubular necrosis. So, in the tubules in the kidneys, we again start seeing cell death, and it leads to acute renal failure. So, acute means that it is a very fast acting failure of the kidneys, and then similar necrosis of cardiac tissue can occur as well. So, basically the heart tissues will also be showing similar symptoms. So, let us see how this looks in the field. So, this is a normal muscle, and as you can see it is a very dark red in color, but when this muscle is affected by capture myopathy, we would have this affected muscle which becomes pale in color. So, this is dark red, this is very light in color, and it gives a very dry appearance. So, this looks very wet in appearance, this is looking very dry in appearance. So, the first presentation when we go for an autopsy of the animal, we would start observing pale muscles, and most of these muscles would be the skeletal muscles or the voluntary muscles. In certain situations, we would also observe ruptured muscles. So, these muscles, so like this is a muscle and this muscle has ruptured out, again because it has accumulated quite a lot of waste products, it has suffered excessive amount of necrosis, and so it is showing quite a lot of rupturing as well. Next, we would observe myoglobinuria. It means that this is the urinary bladder of the animal, and on the inside we can observe the urine of the animal, and this urine has become extremely red in color because this urine is now full of myoglobin. So, this myoglobin was released by the muscle cells, it went through the kidneys and then it has gotten into the urine. So, it is presence of myoglobin in the urine. So, how can we treat capture myopathy? Well, the sad state is that this has a very low success rate. So, essentially if you have an animal that is suffering from capture myopathy, there is very little that we can do. So, the best option is to avoid it, but still what are the treatment options available? Suffers from extreme amounts of pain, we give the animal some analgesics. Now, these analgesics are not going to cure the animal, but it is a humane approach to reduce the pain in the animal. We also give it some muscle relaxants because there are very serious spasms that are going on in the body, and muscle relaxants reduce those. Before transporting the animals, especially in a zoo condition, we can give them vitamin E and selenium to act as antioxidants, and even when there is an animal that is showing some signs of capture myopathy, we can give it vitamin E and selenium, but again the prognosis is not very good. In certain situations, we give it hyperbaric oxygen, which means oxygen at a high pressure, so that the waste products of anaerobic respiration do not form, and even those that are formed are flushed away. We give it sodium bicarbonate to reduce acidemia both in the blood and also in the urine. Then we also give it fluid therapy with balanced electrolyte solutions, often intravenous. So, in the case of fluid therapy, you are giving it quite a lot of electrolytes in water, and in that case the blood becomes thinned out, and it is also helpful in removing the waste products from the body, because the kidneys will start functioning more because they have larger volume of blood to be processed. Next, we also give it intravenous nutritional support, because as we saw in the case of capture myopathy, the animal would start showing symptoms of anorexia, it would stop feeding. So, we give it intravenous nutritional support, and also some amount of muscle support and exercise. So, if there is any damage to the muscles, we try to overcome it by giving some supportive exercises. But then the best way is to prevent this situation from happening, and one way of preventing it is that you first of all recognize that your animal can suffer from capture myopathy. What are the precipitating factors, so that we can remove them or minimize them one by one. The most important thing is to minimize the level of stress that the animal suffers from, to minimize the fear in the animal. So, one, you can minimize handling. So, if there is less amount of handling, the animal will suffer less amount of stress and less amount of fear. When we are transporting the animal, this transportation should be as brief as possible. Do not put this animal into a transportation cage for a very prolonged period of time. Then when we are using drugs for immobilization, choose drugs for a rapid induction, rapid recovery and efficient delivery and physiological stability, and the anesthesia has to be as brief as possible. So, essentially if you have darted an animal and this dart takes 2 hours to act, so in this period of 2 hours the animal gets a sensation that it is losing control over its body, because earlier it was moving fast, now it is getting a feeling of sleepiness, its head is getting high. So, in those situations the animal will start getting a sense of fear, because these are things that also happen when an animal gets a snake bite, for instance. So, whenever we are choosing drugs for immobilization, these drugs have to be extremely fast acting, so that the animal does not get this sense of fear. Even when you are recovering this animal from a drug, then those antidotes should also be fast acting, because the animal should not be in a condition in which it feels that it has lost control over its body. Then delivery mechanism has to be extremely efficient, and the drug has to have a physiological stability in the body. Anesthesia has to be as brief as possible, so that the animal suffers as less amount of stress as possible. Then whenever we are transporting the animal, it should be given tranquilizers. Tranquilizers are those drugs that produce a calming state in the body. So even though this animal is put inside a crate, when it has been given tranquilizers, it will feel easy, it will feel calm, it won't get a sense of anxiety. Next, we should use efficient capture techniques. So the capture techniques should not be those that provide a lot of stress to the animal. And also we can go for herd capturing like the BOMA method. Now what is herd capturing? Now in the case of herd capturing, this is one example from Africa. What we do is that we create a large sized funnel. So this funnel could run for kilometers at a stretch. So there would be poles that are kept in the forest, and on those poles we have attached a plastic sheet, much like what we saw in the case of a pitfall method trap. But in this case, these plastic sheets will be mostly black in color, and the height would be close to around 6 to 8 feet, so that the animal is not able to jump over these. And when we are chasing the animals, in place of chasing a single animal, we would chase the whole of the herd. So the whole of the herd will come into this area. Now once the animal has come into this area, we would start closing off the gates here. So we would be having some gates that are made out of, say, fabric or plastic. So essentially they become just a visual and a psychological barrier for the animals. But when we close these gates, then the whole of the herd is confined into this triangle. Then we would start chasing it into this area towards the end of the funnel, and then when the herd has reached here, we would close a gate here as well. So essentially we are concentrating all the animals into a smaller spot, and when the herd has reached to this point, so here we can see a number of vehicles that have been lined up. So now these vehicles would be standing here, and these animals would go as a herd into the vehicle, and once they are inside the vehicle, there would be a very less amount of light that is given to the animals. So the animals would be given a very less amount of stimulus from the outside. So this whole complete herd is out there in a compartment that is very dark and which is not having quite a lot of sound. But then because all of these animals are kept together, so some amount of social cohesion also helps the animal to reduce the amount of stress. So if you had suppose taken out one single animal from the herd and kept it in an enclosed box with a lot of stimuli, light or sound, then that animal would suffer from quite a lot of stress. But when the whole herd is together and the amount of stimulus is very less, so the animal does not get a huge amount of stress, and in those cases we have observed that capture myopathy can be prevented by as much as 100%. So for instance, in Madhya Pradesh, when we are now translocating Barasinghas from one location to another location, we are making use of the BOMA technique. Now in the BOMA technique, the whole herd of the Barasinghas has been put inside a truck, and then it is moved away. So in those situations, the animals do not get a feeling of stress, and the animals have a very good rate of survival. So in this lecture, we observed what capture myopathy is. It is a condition in which the animals die out in an acute or a chronic fashion, especially just after or maybe in a few days after they were handled or captured or restrained or translocated or transported from one place to another place. Now this is a metabolic disease in which the muscles rupture out, in which the muscles start getting necrosis, the cells start dying, and the myoglobin is released into the bloodstream, and then that myoglobin gets into the kidneys, and it also starts damaging the kidneys. Now we observed how do we diagnose whether a case of an animal death was because of a disease or I mean whether it was because of an infectious disease or whether it was because of capture myopathy. Now in our previous lecture, we had seen that whenever we are translocating animals from point A to point B, we normally keep them in a quarantine facility just to observe whether these animals are bringing any new pathogens into the system. Now when the animals are there in the quarantine facility for say 15 days, and these animals died out at day 10. So how do we make sure whether these animals died because of an infectious disease or because of capture myopathy? So, we looked at instances in which the blood the muscle appears extremely pale, in which we see signs of muscle rupture, and we also seen the presence of myoglobins in the blood. Then we also looked at treatment options available for the animal. So, while these treatment options are not extremely effective to prevent death, but in most of the situations they are effective to prevent the amount of suffering or to reduce the amount of suffering that the animal is getting. And then the best way to counter capture myopathy is to prevent it by, say, using minimal amount of handling of the animal, using efficient capture techniques, using those drugs that act very fast, those antidotes that also act very fast, and preferably going for a herd capture technique such as the BOMA technique. So, that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.